In the high-stakes world of international politics, a 72-hour ultimatum isn't just a threat, it's a weapon of economic war. So, when President Trump issued one to Canada in the early hours of a mid-March morning in 2026, he expected a quick surrender. The world held its breath, waiting for Canada to capitulate to prevent its own economic ruin. The document itself was a 147-page declaration of economic surrender, demanding nothing less than Canada's sovereignty on a dotted line. The clock was ticking. Markets braced for the fallout, and political experts predicted the inevitable, a Canadian government forced to its knees. But what happened next wasn't capitulation. It was something no one saw coming. Just 3 hours later, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a response that didn't just reject the terms, it flipped the balance of power overnight. This is what he said, and this is the story of what happened next. The ultimatum. This crisis didn't just come from nowhere. For months, the trade relationship between the US and Canada had been souring. Arguments over the USMCA, the deal that replaced NAFTA, were getting worse. President Trump, fresh off an election win, was signaling he wanted to renegotiate everything, more aggressively this time. He was even heard in meetings with Alberta separatists, sparking fears that he was trying to destabilize his northern neighbor on purpose. He talked about Canada as a potential familiar first state, a comment that wasn't taken as a joke in Ottawa, but as a scary sign of his administration's true intentions. Minor tariffs were already back, and Prime Minister Carney had started publicly calling for Canada to find new trade partners, a clear sign the government was bracing for a storm. And then, the storm hit. It wasn't a formal diplomatic cable or a late-night call. It was a public statement, blasted across social media and official channels. It was designed for maximum shock and awe. The ultimatum gave Canada just 72 hours, not to negotiate, to accept, and if they didn't, that would trigger the Annex 12 rupture protocol, a terrifying scorched earth campaign of tariffs that would start at 10% and climb, hitting nearly every single Canadian export. The $2 billion in trade crossing the border every day would slow to a trickle, but the demands themselves were what made it so stunning. As one analyst put it, it was less a trade deal and more of a ransom note. The 147-page document aimed to permanently rewrite Canada's role to be a junior partner to America's economy. The first demand was absolute. Canada had to immediately drop all of its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. In other words, Canada had to disarm before the talks even started. The second demand went straight for the jugular of Canada's economy. The Trump administration demanded permanent, fixed prices on all Canadian energy exports. Oil, natural gas, electricity, all would be price controlled not by the market but by Washington. Ottawa saw this for what it was, a hostile takeover of their most valuable sector, locking in cheap energy for the U.S. at Canada's expense forever. Third, the framework insisted that the temporary tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum become permanent. The rates would be a little lower, but it would set the principle that the U.S. could punish Canadian industry whenever it wanted. But the boldest demand was buried deep in the document, in a section called Annex 12. This protocol demanded the complete dismantling of the independent dispute panels under the USMCA. These panels were Canada's only legal defense against unfair American trade tactics. Annex 12 would replace them with a new system where the U.S. had the final say. It was a direct assault on Canadian sovereignty, asking the Prime Minister to sign away the country's right to defend itself under the law. The message couldn't be clearer. This was an edict, not a negotiation. Trump's team was sure that the economic threat of closed factories in Ontario, ruined farmers on the prairies, and a collapsing Canadian dollar would force Carney's hand. They thought that if they backed Canada into a corner, it would have no choice but to fold. It was a disastrous miscalculation. While Washington waited for a panicked call from Ottawa, a strange quiet settled over the Canadian capital. No frantic leaks to the press, no emergency cabinet meetings on the news. The Prime Minister's office just went dark for 1 hour, then 2. That kind of silence was a statement in itself. The West Wing started to get agitated. Were they calling his bluff? Then, just under 3 hours after the ultimatum dropped, the Prime Minister's office announced a press conference. The media scrambled, assuming this was the moment of surrender, maybe wrapped in careful language about protecting Canadian jobs. World leaders and bankers tuned in. Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, walked to the podium alone. He was known for being calm and analytical, the total opposite of his American counterpart's loud bluster. He did not look like a man who was cornered. He looked determined. The statement he was about to give would last only 90 seconds. He started without any preamble. His tone wasn't angry, just firm. The voice of a man stating a simple, unshakable fact. He acknowledged the American proposal and then immediately shut it down. He stated, Canada would not surrender control over its laws or its resources before talks started. That one sentence was a masterstroke. It perfectly reframed Trump's ultimatum not as a trade offer, but as an assault on Canadian sovereignty, and the phrase, before talks started, made the whole thing sound absurd. He then went after the energy demand directly, saying Canada would never accept price controls on energy set by another government. He was drawing a bright red line, turning a debate about tariffs into a fundamental fight for national self-determination. He was tapping into the unwritten rule that every Canadian politician knows. You do not give up sovereignty to the United States. What he didn't say was just as powerful. He never used President Trump's name. He didn't get into the threats or the 72-hour timeline. He simply dismissed the whole thing as a non-starter. He was leaning on a quiet truth that legal experts in Ottawa were already buzzing about. A tweet is not a law. A public ultimatum has no legal power. By refusing to even engage with it, he gave it all the respect it deserved. None. Then, after delivering his core message, he did something incredible. He just stepped away from the podium. No questions. The entire event was over in less than 2 minutes. The effect was immediate. By keeping his response brutally short and laser-focused on the principle of sovereignty, Carney had made surrender politically impossible. Any Canadian leader who tried to backtrack after a statement that clear and defiant would be toast. He had slammed the door on folding. More than that, he'd created what analysts later called a masterful constitutional trap. By framing this as a battle for the nation itself, any province that tried to break ranks and cut its own deal with the U.S. would be seen as committing an act of betrayal. He had just united the entire country behind him. Right after the statement, his government made its move. Before Washington could even figure out what to say, Canada announced it was activating its own contingency plans. The first was a shocker, a temporary moratorium on all new energy export contracts to the United States. It wasn't a total shutdown, but it sent a powerful message. America's reliable supply of Canadian energy could no longer be taken for granted. Canada wasn't just saying no, it was showing it had teeth. The fallout, the 45 minutes that followed Carney's 90-second speech, were pure chaos. The first shockwave hit the currency markets. The US dollar, which had been climbing in anticipation of Canada folding, suddenly stumbled. Traders realized the North American supply chain was facing its biggest threat in a generation and started betting against the dollar. Within 20 minutes of Carney's statement, the greenback took a noticeable dip. It wasn't a crash, but it was a clear taste of the economic pain to come. Inside the White House, the mood reportedly swung from arrogant confidence to what one insider later described as absolute terror. The administration's entire strategy had been built on a quick, easy victory. They didn't have a plan B. The swift rejection, followed by the energy moratorium, caught them completely flat-footed. The bully had just been punched in the nose and for a few critical hours had no idea what to do next. President Trump's favorite weapon, the public threat, had been disarmed. Carney hadn't just rejected the deal, he had ignored the threat itself. This created a new, dangerous problem for Trump. To trigger the NX-12 rupture protocol, Trump himself would now have to be the one to push the button, starting a full-blown trade war that would immediately hurt American consumers and businesses. The blame would no longer fall on a stubborn Canada, but on a U.S. president who chose to light the economic fire. Over the next 48 hours, things escalated. With the 72-hour clock ticking down to a Monday morning deadline, Canada's legal teams launched their own attack. They filed challenges with international bodies not because they expected a quick win, but to build a clear story for the world. The United States was acting like a rogue state, shredding trade agreements it had signed. The looming threat of scorched earth tariffs sent ripples through both economies. The deep connection between the two nations, usually a strength, was now a massive vulnerability. $2 billion of daily trade was on the line. Auto parts makers in Ontario couldn't ship to assembly plants in Michigan. American tech companies in California that depended on clean Canadian hydropower saw their energy security vanish. Farmers on both sides of the border watched the markets for their grain and livestock evaporate overnight. The theoretical pain of a trade war was about to become a harsh reality for millions of families. Carney was making a huge gamble. He was betting that the pain would be felt faster and sharper in the United States. Yes, Canada's economy depended heavily on the U.S., but America had its own weak spots. Key industries were almost totally reliant on Canadian supplies they couldn't get anywhere else. And the American political system, with its constant election cycles, is far more sensitive to angry voters than Canada's is. Carney was betting that American political impatience would force Trump to back down before Canada's economy broke. He was betting that in a war of attrition, the quieter, more unified nation could outlast the louder, more divided one. The world watched, waiting to see if the 72-hour clock would end with a bang or a whimper. A new reality. Monday morning came, but the rupture protocol tariffs didn't. The Trump administration, facing backlash from business leaders and Republican governors in border states, announced a delay for further assessment. It was a weak attempt to save face, but everyone knew what it meant. The bluff had failed. The United States had blinked. That moment wasn't just the end of a 72-hour crisis. It was the start of a new reality in North America. Prime Minister Carney's defiance had shattered the decades-old assumption that Canada would always eventually bend to American will. In the weeks that followed, Carney's government didn't just celebrate, it capitalized on its new leverage. The Prime Minister announced a $1 trillion national investment program, a massive, fast-tracked plan to pour money into strategic sectors like energy independence, AI research, and critical mineral processing. The goal was simple: build a Canadian economy that could stand on its own 2 feet, no longer at the mercy of its southern neighbor. The government also worked to break down trade barriers between Canadian provinces, creating a stronger internal market. At the same time, Canada launched a diplomatic blitz. Carney and his team aggressively sought deeper trade and security deals with the UK, France, and other partners in Europe and Asia. The message to the world was clear: Canada is a reliable partner, it's open for business, and it's a stable alternative to an increasingly unpredictable America. The government also made good on a promise to double defense spending, signaling that Canada was ready to take a more assertive role in its own security. For the United States, the fallout was serious. The failed ultimatum showed the limits of using presidential power as a sledgehammer. Allies around the world, who had been watching the standoff closely, took note. If Canada could stand up to a threat like that, maybe they could too. The event sparked renewed confidence in international cooperation and a push among other G7 nations to protect themselves from American volatility. The scorched earth trade war never happened. Instead, things settled into a long series of legal battles and targeted tariffs. But the ultimate result was undeniable. Canada, under Carney's leadership, had not only defended its sovereignty but had used the crisis as a launchpad to reshape its economic future. The standoff, born from a 72-hour threat, ended up defining a decade of North American relations, proving that even when facing down a superpower, a clear, principled stand can change the course of history. The story of the 72-hour ultimatum is a powerful case study in high-stakes negotiation, a moment where a nation's leader chose sovereignty over submission. It's a compelling alternate history, one that explores just how quickly the balance of power can shift. So, what do you think would have happened next? Could Canada have truly sustained its defiance, or would economic reality have eventually forced a compromise? These are the what-if scenarios that help us understand the forces shaping our world. If you enjoy exploring these pivotal moments in political alternate history, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments below, what other historical what-if would you like to see us tackle next? Thanks for watching. Thanks.